not speaking, can please go ahead and mute yourselves. So right now I'm the only one speaking. So let's go ahead and mute ourselves, everybody. So my name is Natasha. For those of you who have never seen me before, I'm the second vice president here of Audubon Everglades. And I'm going to be doing my best to lead our meeting tonight. So thank you everybody for being here. It's we have a pretty exciting meeting tonight. We're going to be hearing about tree islands. So I'm going to go ahead and everybody should be able to see my screen in a few moments. All right. Can everybody see the screen? Can somebody give me a yes?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. All right. So again, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our July meeting. So we just have a really brief introduction today. I wanted to just remind everybody, if you are not a member, I know most people on here are members, but if you're not a member of Audubon Everglades, please join or renew your membership today. There's a lot of perks to being a member. Additionally, you get to be part of our Audubon Everglades photography group. So if you have questions or would like to be part of the photography group, if you just want to learn more about our photography group, you know, they have separate meetings. It's really a fun group of people. So you can go ahead and email aepgregister@audubon-everglades.org. It's at the bottom of the screen in orange there. And, you know, write back with any information that you want about that. We have some upcoming speakers, so we are going to be taking August off. There is no monthly meeting next month. But after that, we will be having a sneak peek of upcoming presenters after August. So in September, we're going to have Dr. Ken Meyer. August, September is going to be Linda McCauley with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And month after that, I can't think of it right now off the top of my head for some reason. August, September, October will be Dr. John Marsloff. We've got some pretty exciting presentations coming up. And, you know, if anybody wants to be involved with helping to set up these presentations or being involved with our organization at all, you can always contact any of us. And we'd be happy to have help to make all these amazing things happen. So a reminder, if you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat. And then we'll go through the presentations for the presenter at the end of the presentation. We love questions, so please, the more questions, the better. It helps to stimulate some really good discussion. I think our presentation today is going to be really good and help, you know, I think you guys will have a lot of questions. And please, please, please remember to mute yourselves and turn off your video. That just helps everything kind of run a little bit smoother while we're in this crazy internet world. So our presentation tonight is by Dr. Fred Sklar. Did my screen go black? Hold on. I think I went forward too many slides. Yep. Our presentation tonight is by Dr. Fred Sklar. I'm going to just briefly introduce him. If everybody signed up, so I'm assuming you saw the email with his bio. But the presentation tonight is Tree Islands of the Everglades, a chronology of degradation, science, and hope. So Dr. Sklar has a master's in oceanography and a Ph.D. in wetland ecology. He is currently the director of the Everglades Systems Assessment Section at the South Florida Water Management District and has published over 100 articles on the hydrology, soil, plant, and animal processes associated with both the degradation and restoration of wetland and coastal ecosystems. He is also the associate editor for the ESA journal Frontiers in Ecology. He's an executive member of the steering committee for the Florida Coastal Ecosystem Program and the Recover Executive Committee member for the Restoration of the Everglades. A lot of words. Past memberships include the National Environmental Advisory Board to the Chief of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Science and Engineering Advisory Committee for the Louisiana Water Institute of the Gulf, and scientific coordinator for the North Inlet Long-Term Ecological Research Program at USC. So today he's going to be speaking about tree islands, which are hotspots for biodiversity in the Everglades. And, you know, in this presentation, he's going to explore different kinds of tree islands that exist today and look at the science that shed light on their formation and resilience, and hopefully examine a few critical hydrological changes associated with Everglades restoration that will hopefully enhance tree island recovery. So I'm really excited about the presentation today. So Dr. Sklar, if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, I will.
And we can hear you and see you, so that's perfect.
Welcome, everyone. Hi, Peyton. Long time no see. All right, I'm going to share my screen.
All right. Perfect, we can see it.
Right, I'm going to put it in presentation mode. And I'm going to get my pointer options. All right. So today's presentation has 4 components. What is a tree island and why are they important? How is water management linked to tree island degradation? What is the scientific community doing to understand these islands? And then number 4 is the hope part of the title. What will SERP do to protect and possibly restore tree islands? And hopefully we'll have time to share a video that we put together that presents the 5 major restoration projects that will have an impact on tree islands. The image on the right by Clyde Butcher was provided to me when I met with Clyde in 2001 when I was putting together the book on tree islands of the Everglades, and he was just magnanimous in his willingness to give me this wonderful photo. And if you've ever seen it in the original, which is like 6 feet wide and 8 feet long, the detail is just amazing. So what is an Everglades tree island? And so let's start with the definition. They are patches of woody vegetation within a wetland matrix dominated by non-woody species in that matrix. All tree islands form through a combination of directional, moving water and biological activity. All tree islands form in extremely flat landscapes, and they are prevalent around the world, but Everglades tree islands are somewhat unique because they exist in what we call an oligotrophic environment, which means it's a very low nutrient environment. And those type of environments are very rare in the world. The image on the right is showing 2 types of tree islands that dominate in water conservation area 1, or also known as the Loxahatchee Refuge. The big one is called a fixed pedestal island, and the other ones are called battery islands. There are 77 plant taxa associated with these type of islands. And the classical fixed pedestal island is shown here in A. It is teardrop shape. There's a small, very dry head. There's a very large head also that goes underwater occasionally. There's a thing called a near tail, which contains a mixture of flood tolerant species as well as occasionally some terrestrial species. And then the tail is usually made up of sawgrass, and if it's a very high nutrient island, it could have some cattails in there or pond apple. That's one type. The other type here is called a battery type, and it's showing how a battery forms under high water. The air produced by the plants, the CO2 actually lifts the peat up out of the sediment, and wind, the movement of water floats it across, and it gets established on the ridges of the Everglades. These usually happen in very deep water parts of the Everglades. Here is a picture of a battery island. And I'm going to try and close. You can't see it on your screen, but on my screen, I've got stuff in the way. Oh, I can move it. Okay. So this is the beginning of a pop-up or a battery island, a very small one, and we track what kind of vegetation will grow on that. Continuing with our conversation, what is a tree island? Here are just a subpopulation of the 77 types of vegetation. But the thing I want you to notice here in the middle is the hydroperiod. Hydroperiod is the number of days in which a system stays underwater, it's inundated in a year. So the maximum amount would be 360. And what you see here at the bottom, you see that Annona, pond apple, is the one that could stay underwater for the most amount of time, but also Carolina willow. And I just want to show you the type of individual species that you'll find on tree islands. The white stopper and the myrcene are not very tolerant at all of being underwater, so you'll find them just on the head. Strangler fig has a much greater range, and you'll find it on tree islands that about have 60 days of hydroperiod. And then you have cocoa plum, which has a really broad capability of being inundated for long periods of time or short periods of time. And then you've got most of the wet head and the tail being dominated by sweet bay, wax myrtle, which I might add is a critical species for deer, Carolina willows, pond apple, and Dahoon holly. Now the tree islands also differ spatially. The Loctati Refuge is very deep, and it tends to produce pop-ups or battery islands. It still has these fixed islands as well. But when you get into Water Conservation Area 3, which is this central part, you really just have these teardrop-shaped fixed pedestal tree islands. And then when you get down into Everglades National Park, you get islands that whose tails have disappeared because it's dried out, and only these circular type of tree islands exist. But at one time, they too were teardrop shaped. This is an important image here on the left. So I assume most of you have seen this image, but you know where you are in West Palm Beach or Fort Lauderdale or Miami, and you can see the current boundary of the current Everglades. And we'll talk about how that boundary has changed. That's part of the chronology that we'll discuss. Now, this image is probably a little difficult to visualize what's going on, let's focus on the bottom. We took soundings down to 2 meters or so to see what is the limestone rock behind these fixed pedestal islands. And the assumption over the last 50 years has been that the rock below these teardrop-shaped islands would also be teardrop-shaped. And we discovered that indeed it's not, that it's very convoluted. And in fact, it's this convolution that that allows peat to form in these pockets. And what you see on the top here is the in this bluish purple lines, you're seeing the outline of this particular tree island. And this little spot here is the dry head. And if you were to go down into the three-dimensional image on the bottom, you would see that the dry head is actually not on the highest part of the limestone rock below. It's actually in a pit. So it was assumed that the movement of water, the high velocity of the water, actually sculpted the limestone underneath and created these teardrop shape. And that's the first thing we proved that was wrong when I showed up 30 years ago. This table is probably the most important thing to know about tree islands. They are biodiversity hotspots, they're rookery habitats, they're wildlife refuge during high water, they're breeding and nesting grounds for reptiles, amphibians, mammals, and birds. They are archaeological resource sites, and they also have public aesthetic and recreational value. This table here indicates that you're going to find at least, and I think it's grown, although some of these species might have left or gone extinct. We have almost 300 different species living on tree islands or are associated with tree islands. And that makes this particular habitat the hotspot for the entire Everglades. And I want you to notice that of all these species, the highest number are the birds. 137 different species on tree islands are associated with tree islands. There's also, let me go back. I forgot how many butterflies, 29. And here's all 29 butterflies. I didn't produce pictures for all of them, couldn't fit on one page, but this is the list of all the species associated with tree islands. And it is pretty remarkable list. And each one of these species are associated with the different plants that you see there and the hydrology. We'll get into that a little bit more. The number of birds out of the 137, I listed here 62, and these are the 62 that you'll find just at the Arthur R. Marshall-Loxahatchee Refuge. The rest you're going to see in Water Conservation Area 3 and Everglades National Park. It is quite a list, and I don't need to go over I don't need to show you pictures of these because you're Audubon. And you can have separate discussions of certain ones of these. I will, however, talk about the key restoration indicator species. These 4, white ibis, wood storks, great egrets, and snowy egrets, are used in Everglades restoration to evaluate the progress that we're making. And this image that we produce every week at the South Florida Water Management District and share with the water managers to evaluate the type of hydrologic changes we might make to facilitate both foraging and nesting has been used, I would say, for the last 8 years. And what you see here as an example is where the stars are showing you where there are key rookeries. And some of them are pretty high, 8,000 white ibis at the Alley North rookery in this location, 2,000 below Alligator Alley, and then locations along the coast of wood storks and white ibis. And I know most of you saw this when Mark Cook gave his presentation, but this is the most up-to-date figure of the number of nests associated with these 4 indicator species this past year compared to the previous years. And let's see if I can move this over here. Much better. This has not been a particularly good year in 2023 for a number of nests. 2018 was a pretty remarkable year, and that had to do with hinting at the fact that we can get to the super colony threshold associated with historic wading bird populations if we get the hydrology right. And what you don't see here is the fact that getting the hydrology right is not a daily or weekly or even monthly process. It's a multi-year evaluation. And these are using the tree islands as rookeries. And that is absolutely critical. Which brings me to the next part of this conversation, and that is, how is water management linked to tree island degradation? And there's 2 different types of degradation. One is it's too dry. And when things are too dry, the peat subsides. It could even burn. And what you see here is a breakup of the island, and you can actually have the form of the island completely disappear. The other is it's too wet, and the entire peat of the island goes underwater for very long periods of time, and you can't get seedling recruitment when water depths are inundated year after year. The tree seedlings will not be able to recruit or grow if they're underwater. Even something like pond apple, which they tend to float, and if there's a little bit of water there, they might form. But what happens here is you have the formation of a ghost island. So you can see here the level of the peat in relationship to the water level is what's absolutely critical. And you can see that in terms of the ridges as well. This optimum condition is what restoration needs to focus on. And the chronology of hydrological alterations can be broken down into these periods. And I'm not going to go into the details of what happened with each one of these. I will focus on the drainage and then the water conservation. But first, I want you to look at the image on the left and look at where the boundaries of the Everglades were 150 years ago and where they are now. And so you can see that most of the loss is actually in Fort Lauderdale and in Miami, and also in the Everglades agricultural area. And the chronology has a big impact on the tree islands. And I want to quickly show you the sequence. First, we did the canals. So 100 years of modification you just saw in 2 seconds. And I'm going to go over the most significant impacts of these hydrologic alterations. The first were all the major canals that were built beginning in the early 1900s, 1910. We built these 4 canals, and these canals are capable of significantly draining the Everglades 2 times over. And what that did was produce an environment called black gold. And just like the California gold rush, humans rushed to Florida to exploit it and build even more canals to connect to those main drainage canals. So you see people here in this image digging out trenches to connect to a major canal off here in the bottom left, so that we have significant agriculture establishment. The problem is that when you drain the Everglades, it created significant peat fires. And this is an image that shows 2 to 3 feet of peat loss in a single fire. And I think you might have seen this image when Chris McFoy, who used to work at the Water Management District, used to work for me at the Water Management District, his book, this came out of his book. It's an important image because it impacted the tree islands. This is an image by 1940. This is 1940 is the first time we really had a black and white image of an aerial image of the entire Water Conservation Area 3. But by 1940, all the tree islands that were in this northern part of 3A had burnt away. So there were actually, in this image, I believe there's 1,600 tree islands. That's what's showing here. These fixed tree islands, some of them very large, some of them very small, some of them very intense, close together, and others burnt away. In the 50s, we added this northern component to the Everglades. We separated out the Everglades agricultural area. We also, by the 50s, had this red line here where we kept the Everglades away from people. We confined it. The significance of this is that there used to be a big pine apple forest just south of Lake Okeechobee that got now disconnected from the Everglades, and it was an important filter of nutrients. Sheet flow is replaced by inflow structures, which means point sources. So now instead of sheet flow coming off this big sawgrass plain, water would only come in at points here, 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 and here. And the big thing that happened is that we had soil subsidence, because now you've deprived the Everglades of water, and you lose microtopography, and subsidence is the great equalizer. Over the decades, more than 6 feet of peat loss has been lost in the Everglades agricultural area. And the same process that you see here in the EAA occurs on tree islands, that the same soil oxidation has been occurring, what was occurring as a result of being drained. The tree islands lost elevation. The next phase, all of this here on the right-hand side, all of this was added in the 60s and early 70s. And if you add that into the image here on the left, what it essentially did is fully compartmentalize the entire Everglades into 4 components: Area 1, 2, 3, and the park. Now, you might see some other little ones here. This is 2B and this is 3B. So in reality, it's more like 5 compartments but the 3 big ones are 1, 2, and 3. What did that do? Well, by compartmentalizing it, we created these water conservation areas, and they did exactly what we needed. We no longer wanted the system drained. We needed to add water back into the Everglades because at this point, we knew that our drinking water supply was linked to the Everglades. So we learned this around 1980. I'm going back a slide. We learned that we needed to store water here. That's why they're called water conservation areas, because we drained the heck out of them too much. And so we started piling water into them at historic levels and also trying to mimic the water levels that existed 100 years ago. What did that do to tree islands? Well, the image here on the right shows a ghost tree island, and here's a typical tree island. And because of the peat loss, when we brought water levels up, we drowned a bunch of the tree islands. The compartmentalization consequence are these 7 components here. We lost microtopography, flows to Shark River Slough in the park were diverted away from the park. Park hydro periods and depths declined when we compartmentalized. Each water conservation area developed strong hydrologic gradients, which means that the northern part of each conservation area would be dry and the southern part would be very wet. This was a period where phosphorus was coming into the system, water quality went down the tubes, and wading birds continued to decline. So here's that image from 1940, after the system dried out too much, and then the image that's about to come up is going to show you what happens when we developed compartmentalization and we drowned the islands. 65% of the tree islands in water conservation area are gone. If we looked at water conservation area 2, which I'm not going to show you, but I'll tell you, 90% of all the tree islands there are gone. And in Everglades National Park, 60%, just like Area 3, of those tree islands are also gone. So these biodiversity hotspots are in trouble. Now, this particular, we're still talking about how water management is linked to tree island degradation. The image on your right is animated to show you how water levels, the blue line, changes on a monthly basis. You look down here and you'll see each month the time, and I believe this is a 50-year simulation. The brown line is where the sediment surface is. Tamiami Trail is this black line here. Alligator Alley is this line here. And this transect going from the top part of 3A all the way down through Everglades National Park is on the left-hand side. I meant to label it, and I'm sorry I didn't. You have to follow my cursor. It is this transect going from the northern part of 3A down into the central part, crossing Tamiami Trail into the park. All right, now back to the image on the right. The green dots are tree islands. And the thing I want you to notice is that even today, because of Tamiami Trail, it acts as a dam, water levels show a big discontinuity between the southern part of 3A and Everglades National Park. That the islands which should get inundated maybe 60 to 90 days out of the year are hardly getting inundated at all in the park. Whereas the islands in the southern part of 3A are going underwater. Well, not at the moment. More often than not. And this area here in the central part of 3A is what we consider the most pristine tree islands in the system because they've got the right hydrology. And you see in the northern part of 3A that the water levels are dropping below the ground way too much. This is the opposite of restoration. And this is how the system has been, I would say, for the last 50 years. All right, part 3. What is the scientific community doing to understand tree islands? This particular image is showing you the soil total phosphorus on a tree island, on the head, on the near tail, on the tail, compared to the marsh. Now, why am I showing you this? I'm showing you this because, like I said earlier, this is a low nutrient environment. This is an oligotrophic environment. There is the only amount of phosphorus that comes into the system should only be rainfall, particularly at this tree island. And the amount of phosphorus that should be on this tree island is none of these three numbers. It should be 6 grams per meter squared. And yet we go on this island and we find almost up to 3,000 grams per meter squared. And the question became for our scientific community, how in the world can you have 3,000 grams per meter squared in a wetland that has no nutrient input, or at least in this location? And I'm not focusing on where agricultural runoff has changed things. That's another story. But in the park, in central part 3A, on average, we're talking about 100 times more phosphorus on a tree island. And this is where we've been exploring how this could be happening. And I'm going to get into that now. But I want you to know that the other reason we want tree islands to be restored is not just because they're good rookeries, it's because they're the drivers, we think they're the drivers of oligotrophy. That all the phosphorus that lands in the marsh is somehow making it onto the tree islands. And how is that happening? It's happening via bird guano. The birds are feeding on the outside marsh, and then they come and they form a rookery on the tree islands, and they're adding all this nutrient to tree islands. So it's not, the birds have an extreme important functional component in the Everglades. But when we look at the number of birds and we look at the number of tree islands, what we see is birds can't account for everything. So the next thing we did is we looked at the flow of water going across this tree island from upstream to downstream. And what that helped us to understand is that there's something going on in the head that's getting transferred downstream. And that's why you see the tail and the near tail of this island doesn't have anywhere close to the nutrient concentrations on the head. And why is that? Because the trees themselves are able to tap into the groundwater and into the limestone pedestal underneath. And the acid in their roots are able to mobilize phosphorus. And also the water are surrounding the tree islands. This figure shows, it's hard to see these blue lines here. That's surface water being attracted, being transpired by the trees on the head of the island. And also trees catch windborne particulates as well. So those are the components that lead to the high nutrient concentrations. And this is significant because when we get to the hope part, we're going to see that the understanding this groundwater interaction is key to restoration. The other things that we're doing is we're continuing to map the system. We're continuing to look at all the 1,600 square miles of mapping footprint, that when we actually developed a technology, 3D technology, I might say, and that we stopped in 2004. We ran out of money. That's the sequence of tree island maps that we created, cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce. But now our satellite imagery has gotten a lot more refined, and we're moving towards that. And I'm hoping that in the next year or two, we're going to have an updated map of the tree islands to see if in the last 15 years, there's been a significant increase or decrease in tree islands. The other thing that we're doing is we're visiting ghost tree islands. And here's some of my colleagues back in 2010 on a location that used to have trees on them. And they're traveling along this transect that in 1973, it was already disappearing. But in 1952 was a solid, this transect was a solid tree island. And they're looking to see, is there a remaining seed bank? And is there a hydrologic change that we can create that would get those seed banks to germinate? The other thing that we have been doing over the last 20 years is creating a living laboratory called LILA. LILA, one of its main components of LILA is to look at tree island restoration and develop lessons for how we do restoration. This is an image looking west. This shows all 4 macrocosms in LILA, and it shows, before we did any planting, 8 potential tree islands that we would study. LILA is probably the most unique hydrologic experimental system in the world. It's 80 acres, and it's designed to maintain extremely low nutrients, but to alter the flow across 4 macrocosms by using a below ground electric pump and recirculating that water through LILA back to the pump, and never having any outside source other than rainwater contributing to the movement of that water. And we have the ability to shut flows off in 1 or 2 of the macrocosms to evaluate the impacts of flow, and evaluate quite a number of features, like the reptiles that are using tree islands, or the fish changes. We've done quite a number of things, but just focusing on tree islands for this talk, in each macrocosm, there's 2 tree islands, but 1 tree island is actually on a limestone base. Now, why would we put a tree island on a limestone base? And that's because when we do Everglades restoration, the plan is to remove levees. The levees are all made out of limestone. And the question is, can we use a limestone base like you would a pedestal limestone fixed tree island to create tree islands? And so what we did is we had 1 island that was just filled with peat, and another island that was limestone, but then peat was put on top of it. And what we did is we planted 5,700 trees. We planted 8 species. And this is an image of the tree island in 2006. Well, both these images showing the pattern that we did. The pattern is actually here in the left-hand corner. Let's see if this zooms up. It's really, from a plant ecology point of view, we assume that this highly dense planting, each color is a different species, by the way, would do poorly because of competitive interactions between all the trees. And somewhere in between, some of these other 3 densities would do better. And I want to show you. This is in 2006. Now, this is not regular photography. This is infrared photography. So the redder the vegetation, the environment, the more green and the thicker the vegetation is. And what you see, these lines in here are what we had to do. We planted during the dry season, which it's easier for planting, but if it gets too dry like it is today, they could die. And so we had to set up an irrigation system temporarily. This is 2007, 1 year later, but you can see that high density planting is actually showing up redder. And it really shows up in 2 years later in 2008. It is going gangbusters, opposite of what we thought. And here it is, 2009. And then the rest of the island seems to catch up somewhat, but not along the edges. The edges are underwater a lot of the time, and it's not conducive for these trees. And it had to do with the flood tolerance of some of the species, which is key information that we found about trees on tree islands. And then we switched to 2011, typical aerial photography. It's not infrared anymore. But essentially, we created a tree island by 2011, 2014. This is, and I guess that's where we stop. I think this is the last slide for what the scientific community is doing to understand tree islands. And focusing on that groundwater interaction with the surface is what we were able to focus on by putting wells on all these tree islands and understand what happens when the vegetation is young. And so this image here at the right shows when the vegetation is young, pretty much all the water just flows off the tree islands and goes into the surrounding sloughs and into the groundwater. But look what happens when you have older and bigger tree islands, that the flows are now extremely different. And particularly for limestone, there's a significant movement of water from the edges of the tree islands into the center. But that also the water table under a limestone is significantly lower because the trees are lowering it. The trees are creating a depression, a hydrologic depression, which helps to move water back into it. The peat does this as well, but not as well as the limestone. There is water moving into the tree island from the surrounding environment. All right, last chapter. What will SERP do to protect and possibly restore tree islands? I have two versions of this. Hopefully the one that's local on my PC is going to work. This is a video I made for the general public about 6 months ago. Let me get rid of my pointer options. You need to let me know if you actually can hear this once I pull it up. Everglades Restoration is the largest wetland restoration program that. Can you hear it?
Yes.
It's working, Fred. Yep.
Okay, here we go. Any state or federal agency has ever designed or implemented in the world. There are literally hundreds of components associated with this effort to revive this unique wetland. Way too many to discuss in a short video such as this. However, for many of us working to maximize the ecological benefits of this restoration, There are 5 very special modifications that we at the South Florida Water Management District feel you should be aware of. I think that you will agree that these 5 projects capture the grand spatial scale and sweeping scope of Everglades restoration. We have started to implement some of the keystone features of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, also known as SERP. SERP and its associated stormwater treatment areas will reverse over 100 years of ecological degradation by increasing flows across the greater Everglades. Due to this degradation, we now have vast areas that are too dry, where the rich organic soils have been burnt away, where dense cattails destroy wading bird habitat, and where exotics dominate. We also have areas that are too wet, where depths are too great for wading bird foraging, and where tree islands get flooded and die. Although Everglades Restoration is a complex suite of over 60 projects, there are 5 major elements that will, in combination, provide much of the hydrological and ecological benefits associated with greater Everglades restoration. Starting in the south and working our way north, we witnessed the construction of a great seepage barrier, a curtain wall designed to slow the migration of groundwater out of Everglades National Park and preventing the flooding of vital farmland to the east. The construction of a trench for this below-ground cement wall required one of the largest chainsaws ever built. Just north of this curtain wall is a second key feature, the Tamiami Trail bridges. In 2012, Everglades National Park and the Florida Department of Transportation started the process of removing parts of Tamiami Trail, a road built in the 1920s depriving what is now Everglades National Park of essential supplies of water. Now that that road under these bridges has been removed, the floodgates have been opened. Opening the floodgates includes the removal of the L29 levee and the implementation of the third keystone element called the Combined Everglades Planning Process South, also known as CEP South. CEP South will deliver on average 350,000 acre-feet of new water to the park. In 2021, this restoration effort began the process of removing spoil banks and constructing large culverts to create a flowway and reconnect Water Conservation Area 3A to the park. This will help relieve the stress of extended ponding and high water in the southern regions of Water Conservation Area 3, where some 60% of the tree islands have disappeared. Moving further north to the very top of Water Conservation Area 3A is CEP North. CEP North is designed to remove a 3-mile-long levee and evenly distribute on average some 370,000 acre-feet of flow. Historically, this region distributed large quantities of water through a healthy ridge-slough landscape. Today, this region is choked with willows and cattails. CEP North will divert water away from the Miami Canal and backfill the Miami Canal to remove it as a predominant drainage feature and insert hydrologic speed bumps that will function as forested biodiversity hotspots and restore hydroperiods. Even further north is the plan for the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir, also known as the EAA Reservoir. This reservoir will pull water from Lake Okeechobee into the Miami Canal and the North New River Canal. Once in the reservoir, water will flow in multiple directions, giving water managers the flexibility to optimize both water quality and water quantity. After traveling through a stormwater treatment area, this new water will be pumped south into Water Conservation Area 3A as part of CEP North. As a result of the longer hydroperiods and deeper water that will come with these 5 keystone features, the sloughs within the Everglades will stay hydrated
for longer periods of time, and as a result, fish populations will increase by some 30 to 50%. During dry years, the fish population is expected to increase by almost 100%. Of course, when fish increase, almost everything else will follow. The aerial extent of good foraging conditions in Shark River Slough will improve for wood storks and white ibis by some 30%. The alligators will be able to spread out more. This in turn will increase the resilience of the Everglades by providing an expanded number of alligator holes, holes where fish and wildlife aggregate during the dry season. And crayfish, a staple food for wading birds, fish, mink, and otters, should also make a dramatic rebound. We are now close to getting the water right, closer than we have ever been. These 5 fundamental elements of Everglades restoration will increase hydroperiods and flows, providing for a more resilient landscape and protecting the water needed for fish and wildlife. Without these features, there would be little hope for plant and animal recovery.
Well, that's it. Thank you for your attention, and I guess time for questions.
Yeah, so everybody, please put your questions in the chat, so it's not just me with all of my questions. Thank you, Fred. That was an amazing presentation. I learned so much. So the first question that we have is from me. So do you think that the increased amount of nutrients that are in water now, like, you know, runoff water from agriculture and stuff, do you think that that increased load of nutrients will change or impact the growth of any new tree islands that are planted or that are enhanced out in the Everglades?
The amount of phosphorus that's come in, what it's done is it's created these large willow beds. And the willow beds are not the same thing as tree islands. And, you know, you have to picture the fact, you have to have tree islands within a matrix of ridges and sloughs, and having a giant forest of willows is not the same thing. It doesn't provide the habitat needed to act as a rookery. And it's actually something that we've been thinking about, figuring out a way to remove the willows, and maybe in that way we might be able to create islands out. We might be able to sculpt areas where we leave willows in place, but I think the energy involved of trying to do that would be quite extensive and expensive.
All right, so that leads me to one related question, then I'll go on to the next question in the chat is, what kind of fire frequency would these tree islands have seen historically? Do we know about like a fire return interval for these that would like help it be a healthy ecosystem, or would fire not be important to the tree islands?
Fire is not important to tree islands. Fire is important for surrounding marsh, but the humidity of a typical tree island is such that it tends to prevent the encroachment of fire from the surrounding marsh. The thing that does happen, or historically happened, it hasn't happened in a very long time, is a tree island nested in a marsh that has a peat fire. So a peat fire, you know, you might not actually see the fire, it might be underground, and it would migrate underground towards a tree island, and they would kill a tree island.
It's very interesting. Thank you. All right, so the next, there's a comment from Mark Cook, who kind of commented on the hydrological, how tree islands are impacted by hydrological conditions. And one of the key findings, he says that you and all your minions. So one of the key findings that you guys have found is that drier conditions allow the invasion of non-native reptile and amphibian species and a corresponding reduction in native reptiles and amphibians. So can you speak a little bit to the change in hydrological conditions and how that has changed the wildlife that would have been there historically versus what is present now on these tree islands?
Well, Mark's referring to a study that we funded at the University of Miami, in which we asked the graduate students there to document the amphibian and reptile population in Lila on the tree islands, and looking at the hydrology of tree islands that tend to be drier compared to tree islands that are wetter. It was found that there was more of the invasive reptiles on the drier islands. And the reason why I think Mark is bringing this up is because there is currently a big debate in the policy and water management community, and also in the scientific community, about just how wet a tree island can get. And it's clear that the vegetation has hydrologic tolerances, and that if things are too wet, they won't grow. And so trying to find the balance between keeping it wet so that the natural population of alligators and wading birds and reptiles is intact can be at opposite ends of where you need to be to establish a healthy plant community. So it might be that when we start backfilling the Miami Canal and we actually start building tree islands as part of restoration, that initially we'll run the system with a little less water, so that well, actually I can't say that either. It's going to be I was going to say we'll run it with less water so the plants get a chance to establish themselves first. The problem with that is you could get Brazilian pepper invading if it's too dry, or even lygodium. I actually didn't go into the whole lygodium issue on tree islands. I'm still sharing my slide, aren't I?
Yes.
Yeah, so this image here is showing the water conservation area what lygodium does to a tree island. It just collapses it from the weight of the lygodium, and that's because it tends to appear in areas that dry out periodically. So the paradox for tree islands is that to keep the islands healthy, you have to bring the water levels down more than they were historically. But at the same time, if you want to restore the ridge and slough system and you want to deliver all the water that Everglades National Park needs, you could drown more tree islands.
It's a complicated issue, so it's a long answer, but
yes, it is a long answer.
I like that though. No, you're fine. It kind of leads us into the next question, which was from me, and then this was my last one, I promise. All right, so you know, STAs and FEBs are a large part of Everglades Restoration at the Water Management District as part of, you know, the SERP, NEEP, restoration strategies, all those programs. A lot of STAs and FEBs are built. Do you think that tree islands should be incorporated into the design of these projects? Would that provide any kind of benefit, or is the purpose of an STA just for water quality and that's it?
I've been told that the STAs are designed just for water quality and that's it. That it's mandated to produce a certain phosphorus concentration. And if we were to build a tree island in the middle of an STA, what would it do? It would attract wading birds, particularly if they're going to create a rookery there. And all the guano that would come with the wading birds would actually create a problem for the STA.
Okay, that's what I thought the answer was, but I just wanted to, to kind of hear what you had to say about it. Mimi Borge says, thank you so much for all your dedication. Sue Ravi has a question. She says, I think it's supposed to be any impact to panther populations of all of this triaging. So I guess like the loss of tree islands, has it caused any impacts to the panther populations? Sue, please correct me in the chat if I did not get your question right.
I'm going to stop sharing. Is that okay?
Yes, go ahead.
If I could figure out how to do it.
It should be at the top of your screen or wherever that little green thing that you moved.
Yeah, I did.
It'll be there. I can do it for you. Oh, no, I didn't. Never mind. I turned you off. Turn your video back on.
Well, that's okay. I shut my
Sure.
video off.
I accidentally did. Can you turn your video back on? I was trying to see if I could stop sharing your screen for you.
Okay.
Yeah, you're back.
Okay.
So yeah, if there's been any impact to panther populations from all of the loss of tree islands.
There's there could be. There could be, yeah. I'm not aware of any particular type particular individual panthers that were impacted by the loss of tree islands, but certainly the panthers are using the tree islands.
Okay. Mark Pencower would like to know, do you know how many tree islands are within the Arthur R. Marshall National Wildlife Refuge?
That's a good question. No, I can't give you an exact number. The number of islands in the refuge has not declined like they have in the other part of the system because the refuge has been managed with a lot more water. So the islands that were there have not lost as much peat as the rest of the system. So when water levels come up, they don't drown. So off the top of my head, I would say there's about 600 fixed pedestal islands and probably close to 3,000 of the battery islands.
Oh,
Yeah, it's not the tree islands are not the big problem in the refuge is the lygodium infestation.
that's incredible. So Mark Silfkin says, fantastic presentation and wants to know how and/or will rising seawater levels impact the long-range restoration plans and tree islands?
Well, the sea level is going to affect the mangroves along the coast. And there are mangroves that you might consider to be tree islands because they are in a matrix of a surrounding marsh. But the tree islands that are really close to the coast, the salinity will kill them for sure. But there aren't that many. I mean, once you start getting close to the coast, those tree islands are replaced by mangroves. And as you know, mangroves can tolerate salt water pretty well.
All right. Anne Wiley says that I've also called the floating islands in the Everglades bayheads. Is that a correct term?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Bayheads refer to it being Sweet Bay, or it's referring to the trees. And they're not floating. The only ones that are floating tend to be the Battery Islands.
Maureen Swanson asks, where does the funding come from for all this restoration work? And how does that relate to all the money earned? So.
The money comes from your property tax. The district charges, I forgot what percentage of your property value goes directly to the South Florida Water Management District. And the other source of money is matching funds from the federal government. So Everglades Restoration is 50-50 cost share, which is remarkable for a Corps of Engineers project. Usually it's 75% by the state and only 25% by the federal government. But the Everglades has a special place in the federal government, and so we've been able to maintain a 50-50 cost share.
Yep, thank you. Jeannie Melzer asks, once the hydrology is improved, will trees need to be reintroduced, or do we expect them to return on their own?
We expect them to return on their own. The scale of trying to bring back tree islands is beyond our capabilities. We're doing an experiment right now where we are looking at how we planted in Lila and looking at how we might do it on ghost tree islands where there's some remnant elevation and there's a historic precedent at those sites. And my staff is going out there and planting trees that have a lot of flood tolerance. It seems to be working. We just started doing that a few years ago. And you'd be surprised to know that we're doing it very simply. We go to Home Depot, we buy peat moss, we buy a package of peat moss, we punch a hole in it, and we plant a seedling, and then we carry it out by an airboat to a tree island, and we just plop it in there, and they're actually doing pretty well. So if that works, then the answer might be qualified. Yes, we might be able to do it on a bunch of islands, and we'll see.
That's pretty amazing. I like that it's kind of like a low-tech way of
Right.
doing. I like
Yeah.
that. Paul Gorday would like to know, how are the numbers of the 4 indicator bird species counted or estimated each year?
Oh, that was a question for Mark Cook. So Mark goes out in our helicopter and takes pictures and estimates the foraging. As far as the nesting goes, Recover, which is part of the scientific wing of the restoration effort, and my organization, we put our money together and we pay different universities and different state agencies to actually go out and count nests on these tree islands. And another sidebar here is that they're developed at the University of Florida. They have developed artificial intelligence to actually identify nests by the photographs. And so you can give a computer a photograph. Right now, a human does it. And so a human can train the computer to say, well, okay, this is an ibis, this is a nest, and this is a nest with chicks, or this is a nest with eggs. And the computer can learn how to identify it. So that's something that we're experimenting with right now. So AI is not necessarily a bad thing everywhere.
That sounds really cool. Maureen has another couple of questions. So she wants to know, how does this relate to all the money earmarked over the years slated to Everglades restoration?
The science that we do is a drop in a bucket compared to all the engineering and the construction associated with Everglades restoration. You know, building pumps and building STAs. I mean, we're talking about modifications, physical modifications to the system that's hundreds of millions of dollars a year for the last 15 years. You know, my budget for Everglades science is $3.5 million, which from a scientific point of view is pretty rich. From an Everglades restoration program, looking at this 1,600 square miles of wetland, it's not enough.
I can imagine, just from the numbers I hear at work as well, that's almost as much as it costs to build an STA. Maureen would also like to know, what human encroachment issues do you see on the horizon that could put your plans at risk?
Climate change. And the climate change has a lot of uncertainty associated with it. The big one is rainfall. Well, actually, it's all sea level rise, rainfall, and temperature. You put those three things together, and we might get a fungal infection on the tree islands that we plant. We might get more soil oxidation if it's too dry, and we'll never be able to get the peat. We'll never be able to get an elevation high enough to not drown. There's a fair amount of uncertainty due to climate change, and along the coast, the biggest one, of course, is sea level rise, but that's affecting Everglades National Park more than the tree islands that we're talking about today.
Scott and Mary have asked that, assuming the Everglades restoration funding is maintained at its current levels and restoration continues relatively unimpeded, when do you anticipate a consistent return to more historical wading bird breeding levels?
Well, the big thing that has to be built is the EAA reservoir and the whole increased flow at SEP North that the video highlighted. Those two things are not expected to be completed till about 2029. And of course, the Everglades is not going to automatically flip to a healthy system just because those systems are completed in 2029. I imagine it would be 5 years after that before the system is coming close to where SERP predicted it would be.
So in the 2030s sometime.
Yeah.
Likely early 2040s.
We could be optimistic, cautiously optimistic, and say 2034.
All right. I like it. Optimism is good. Kristen Larson says, thank you for a terrific talk and video. Have you seen any conclusion, or have any conclusions been drawn from the seed bank study yet?
Yes, the seeds are gone. That the wetland woody species that would make for a tree island do not last more than 6 months. We were hopeful that maybe being buried and being in an anaerobic environment, a low oxygen environment, that they wouldn't decompose. But we didn't find any viable seeds on any of the ghost tree islands.
Carol Watson would like, or she says, this was an excellent, easy to understand presentation of a difficult, oftentimes confusing subject. You had a wonderful, nice level pace of your voice. Well done. And she loved the video at the end.
Good. Thank you.
And then Mark Cook commented, he says that he would hazard a guess that panthers didn't use too many tree islands in the historical Everglades, and that the central Everglades was historically much deeper and the islands were surrounded by alligators. Panthers do like entering water, especially when there are alligators, and there would be few prey species on the islands surrounded by such deep water. So he had that, and those are all the questions in the chat. If anybody has any other questions for Dr. Sklar, feel free to enter them in while I am looking at my notes to make sure I didn't have any more questions. But thank you so much. That was an incredibly informative and interesting presentation. So thank you so much for taking your time to, give this presentation tonight. And it seems like those are all the questions. So with that, I'll go ahead and just remind everybody that we do not have an August meeting. We're taking August off to plan next year, all the following months, wonderful Audubon field trips and presentations and social events that we're trying to get together. So I hope everybody has a wonderful August. And thank you again, Fred, for being here. That was wonderful. And with that, I will say good night. Everybody have a wonderful evening and see you in September.
Thank you for inviting me.
Good night, Natasha.
Good night.